Hello, this is Christian Idealism, and today I'm going to answer 3 questions for you guys, which some might find interesting. The first question is, what would convince me that Catholicism is false? Because I'm a Catholic. Number 2 is, what would convince me that Christianity is false? So some kind of mere Christianity. And then finally, what would convince me that theism itself is false? So here's the thing. If you can disprove theism, then you can also disprove Christian theism and Catholicism. If you can only disprove Christianity, then you can also disprove Catholicism, but it wouldn't disprove theism. And then if you could disprove Catholicism, then Christianity or bare Christian theism and theism would be safe, right? And so I'm going to start off with answering the first of those, which is, what would convince me that Catholicism is false? So there's a few things. So the first thing that would convince me that it's false is if one can demonstrate a formal contradiction between what one council says in its final dogmatic statements versus what another council says. And what I mean by a formal contradiction is not simply just, it's only they seem to contradict. No, you have to actually show that formally something like A, and then over here it says not A. And then within those contexts, you cannot interpret it any other way or understand it in any other difference. If you can show a formal contradiction between those two things, that would disprove conciliar infallibility and therefore Catholicism as a whole. Or if you can show, let's say, a formal contradiction between papal infallibility and what a council says. So the closest example to this would be what Pope Vigilus does. I think it's it's one of the controversies. I forgot exactly which controversy it was. But yeah, so it would be something like that. And I've thought about that case many times because certain Orthodox have thrown it at me as an objection to Catholicism, and I do think those kind of arguments are probably the strongest, because if you can show a formal contradiction, then it doesn't really matter any kind of evidence. No amount of evidence could overturn, right, a formal contradiction. It would just be a logical problem. So yeah, if you can show a formal contradiction within Catholicism itself, so like with what the council says or what papal infallibility statements are, right, then you could show that Catholicism as a whole is an incoherent system and therefore needs to be abandoned. That's one path you could go. Another path you can go is to disprove it from a historical perspective. So if there's good evidence to think that that any of the church dogmas are false, we have like positive, not just a lack of evidence it's not, so it wouldn't just be a lack of evidence in favor of a Catholic dogma. We actually have evidence against a Catholic dogma. Like if we had good reason to think that Mary wasn't a perpetual virgin, or if we had good historical data to think that, like for example, if we found Mary's dead body or her corpse or something to disprove the assumption, that would completely, that would just destroy, Catholicism would be proven false overnight. Now, of course, you don't have to go that strong. So that's a strong way you could disprove it. Another way you could disprove it, I would say, is if you can show that Catholicism is incompatible with some kind of universal reconciliation, or at least that that there's no good reason to think that the Catholic God would have any interest in saving all people, then that would call into question the morality of the Catholic God, and therefore would have me question whether this thing is true, like it can actually be trustworthy or not, right? Because for me, I'm not just looking at, whether it's true or not. What I care also about is the moral character of the God in question. Because if I discover that the God behind Catholicism in this case is an immoral God, then I have more reason to believe that this God is actually just a demiurge. Like, even if he did exist, like, I have no reason to believe that this is like an all good being or something. And so I would just say, yeah, the Catholic God exists, but he's just a demiurge, and so I have no reason to like follow him or anything. That would be another path you could go. I've given a similar answer to Calvinism as well. Like, if I found out Calvinism was true, then that's the approach that I would take. But anyways, the point is being, there's a moral issue that you could throw against Catholicism, but then there's also like evidential issues, which is what I just mentioned, right? And then finally, I think the last thing that would convince me that Catholicism is false, or at least highly unlikely, is if you can undercut a lot of the arguments for Catholicism. So, for example, if you can show that typological maximalism is false, which is basically a theory of typology and how there's transfer between the Old and the New Testament, if you can show that hermeneutic, that framework is false, or at least doesn't actually explain the data that we're trying to explain, then that would undercut a lot of the arguments that in favor of Catholicism. And so I would just be like, yeah, like I would just have to leave, basically. Now, that's just Catholicism. Okay, so now I'm going to get a little bit deeper. What about Christianity? What would convince me that Christianity is false? Well, there's quite a few things, but I'll give you the first more extreme example, and then I'll kind of go into evidential considerations. So if we discovered the body of Jesus, that would just completely destroy Christianity. Like, Christianity would be false, or proven false overnight. I would have no reason to think that Jesus Christ is who he claimed to be if we came across his body. Like, that would just completely destroy the religion, like from just a purely evidential basis. Now, of course, there's ways you can get around that. You could say, oh, well, he duplicated his body, and so he resurrected in some different body. But at that point, you could do that for anything. Like, you can throw in any ad hoc hypothesis to explain the data. It's not really going to help you, right? So, sure, you could get around even that objection, but you can do it for any hypothesis, so it doesn't really matter. It would certainly, I would just have to flat out leave. Another thing too that would be a problem for Christianity is if we had to take a literalistic view of the Old Testament, specifically like the slaughter of the Canaanites, like all those Old Testament passages that atheists bring up. If there was no other possible way to interpret those other than God wanted to slaughter the Canaanites, or God wanted those things to happen and that he permitted those things to happen, then I would be like, okay, well, now we have a moral problem, and so I have good reason to think, just from an internal critique perspective, that Christianity is false. Another thing that would push me against Christianity is if I learned that eternal conscious torment was the only possible interpretation. Now, of course, I was going to mention this in the Catholic section, but I think it's actually more relevant for the Christianity section, because if it's the case that eternal conscious torment is the only possible interpretation, and that we have to accept the proposition, like from an infallible standpoint, if we have to accept the proposition that there is any creature that is eternally in hell, then I basically have to accept the proposition that, well, sin won. So, like, God didn't actually save everybody. But then, more importantly, that evil actually won. So, God's not the victor in the story. God failed his mission. And so, if I learned that is the only possible interpretation that I can take, and that there's no way around it, just from a biblical perspective or something, then I would just leave Christianity and be like, hey, well, then the Christian story is false, because if Christianity is true, and if an all good being exists, if there's a perfect God that exists, then I would predict Christianity, if it's true, to be the best possible story, right? Of course, the best possible story is the story of universal reconciliation. But if I learn that Christianity is not that story, that Christianity is actually against universal reconciliation, then I would just leave Christianity and be like, hey, well, then it's just not the best possible story, and therefore, whoever, if there is a perfect God that exists, he's just not in charge of the Christian religion in the first place. So that would be a way you could I would be convinced that Christianity is false. And those are just more logical, I guess, issues. Now, from an evidential perspective, it would be a little more interesting. I think if one could show that the Gospels are unreliable in what they claim, like if I went with Richard Miller's hypothesis or with some other view, or let's say I was convinced that the New Testament writers were just borrowing from the Old Testament and then inventing things as they went along. If I was convinced of those kind of literary hypotheses, those fictionalization hypotheses, then yeah, I wouldn't be a Christian, because obviously, well, then it would just be fiction, right? So those would be, just from a purely Christian perspective, is what would convince me that Christianity is false. Is if I was convinced that there is a good case to be made for fictionalization theses, if I discovered that there's the body of Jesus, or if I discovered that the Christian story is not the best possible story, those would be a number of things that would convince me it not to be true. Now, another way you could go is if you could undercut a lot of the arguments for Christianity. So, like, for example, if I was convinced that a lot of the modern miracle stuff that Caleb Jackson brings up, if I was convinced that those were actually, like, faulty or there's a lot of problems, then I would question, right? So I'd be pushed against Christian theism. Or if I was convinced that the data for the resurrection is just not really there from an evidential standpoint, then I would be pushed against Christianity. Or, I mean, those are really the only two things I would say, but yeah, so the main things is, number one, if I was convinced that, actually three things. So number one, if I was convinced that the maximalist case for the resurrection was bad, or at least that a lot of the evidence in support of that can be undercut, I would question it. If I was convinced of fictionalization theses, I would just flat out leave. And then if I was convinced that, I'll do an or. It's not and, it's an or. Or if I were convinced that a lot of the modern miracle stuff is just a bunch of BS, then I would start questioning. I wouldn't necessarily leave Christianity, but I would definitely start to question it. If I came to find out, like, oh, all these modern miracle stuff is just nonsense. So that's what I would do. Now, here is the last one. What about theism itself? What would convince me that theism is false? So this one's a little more complicated because on my framework, I think that the evidence against theism is going to have to be put in terms of two kinds of categories. In that whatever these categories are is going to push back. So number one, if we discovered a potential entity that could not exist without suffering, like just from a purely, like it's in its nature to cause suffering, then I would start to really question, just from a purely evidential basis, whether God exists or not. Sorry, I'm gonna get my bird out because she is crying for me. Anyways, so there's that. If we discovered, like, for example, if we discovered Pennywise existed, I would just be like, all right, theism's false. Or if I were convinced of an alternative theory that could explain the data better. So something like, here's a few examples, like axiarchism, right? If that explained the data better. Or if something like ultimism explained the data better. So J.H. Selenberg's ultimism. If I came to think that those actually explain the data better than theism, even with my framework, then I would just adopt those views, and then I couldn't be a theist anymore, because obviously I just go with the better theory. That would be the simplest way to do it. The more complex way would be to try to find entities that are like Pennywise, essentially, or if we came across a kind of evil that could not be integrated into a larger whole, and then of course that would have to be determined by our higher order theory of value, and then that would also be determined by our underlying metaphysical views, right? So on that note, I think on the last note, when it comes to those specific things, I think the evidence against theism that would be the most persuasive for me from a more realistic perspective would be if someone could convince me that if someone could convince me of this higher order theory, like let's say a theory of identity, and in that theory of identity entailed, for some reason, that there is no afterlife, or at least that an afterlife is highly unlikely, then I would start to question my theism, because my theism entails the afterlife. And so if I were given good reason to think that there is no afterlife, given some identity issues, or just from a metaphysical basis, then I would question my theism, because if you can show that an afterlife is unlikely, then you can show that theism is unlikely on my framework. So yeah, those are the main things for me that would convince me that my beliefs, my religious beliefs, are false, right? So yeah, when I put out this video, I'm gonna title it "What Would Convince Me That My Religious Beliefs Are False," and these are all most of my religious beliefs, so that's what would convince me. So yeah, those are the main things, and of course that leaves it open to any atheist that wants to try to convert me to whatever, right? That's what you have to do if you want to convince me, that if you want to challenge my beliefs. I've given you plenty of ways you can do it, right? Giving you plenty of holes in my own views, and then you can just go in there and expand the hole to make it bigger, and then see where the issues might actually lie. But anyways, I hope that helps to answer at least that underlying ultimate question. Anyways, I've gone on for very long. This is actually my longest short video, so I'm gonna stop it here. But anyways, have a nice day, guys.